Road workers began repairing the pavement, removed the top layer of asphalt, and froze in bewilderment. Under the familiar black coating, just a couple of centimeters from the surface, a strange metal structure was discovered. This wasn't modern reinforcement or remnants of some utilities. Before the workers' eyes lay a forged iron grid, primitive at first glance, but covering the entire width of the road. The metal looked old, clearly not steel. Most likely ordinary iron that was once forged in blacksmith shops. The structure rested on a layer of gravel, and the elements weren't connected to each other at all. Everything held together simply under its own weight and the pressure of the upper layers. A logical question arises. If there was such a solid and durable surface underneath, why was asphalt needed at all? You could drive perfectly well on this metal pavement without additional coating. People gathered around the unusual find, taking photos and discussing. The pavement looked intriguing, even after so many years underground. But the most striking thing was something else. There's no information anywhere about these roads. Not in archives, not in historical documents, not in city chronicles. As if someone deliberately erased mentions of an entire network of metal roads that once covered the streets. The author of the find asks the question, how could it happen that there were many such roads, but they've all either disappeared or been hidden? Some were melted down for metal, possibly during times of acute iron shortage. Others were simply paved over with asphalt, as in this case. Melting down can still be given some rational explanation, like necessity forced it. But why hide a functioning road under new coating? Imagine the process. Road workers arrive, see an excellent metal pavement that serves perfectly well, over which carts and people travel without problems, and decide to pour asphalt over it. Don't they have questions? Don't they want to know who built this, when, and why? They just take it and cover it up as if ashamed of something or following someone's orders. If you're interested in learning the truth about forgotten technologies of the past, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the solution to this story, because what you've just learned is only the tip of the iceberg. There were far more metal roads than you can imagine, and their fate hides even stranger facts. This find turned out to be far from unique. Similar metal pavements were discovered in various cities and towns. Somewhere they were found by accident during utility repairs. Somewhere during large-scale street reconstruction. Each time the picture repeated, under a relatively thin layer of asphalt lay a forged iron structure, sometimes in excellent condition, sometimes partially damaged by time. The scale of this phenomenon is staggering. We're not talking about a few meters of experimental coating on some central square. Metal covered entire streets, hundreds of meters long, possibly even more. The volume of work, the amount of material, the level of process organization indicate that this was standard practice, mass production of road surfaces of a certain era. But what happened to these roads? Their fate varied, and none of the options adds clarity to this story. A significant portion of metal pavements were simply melted down. The official version might sound like this: need for metal, wartime, industrialization requires resources. Sounds plausible, if not for one detail. Even if we assume that metal was urgently needed, why isn't the process of destroying roads reflected in any document? Imagine the scale of the operation. Dismantle metal coating from city streets. Transport it for remelting. Organize this process in dozens, maybe hundreds of cities. This is colossal work, requiring planning, orders, reporting. Where are the documents? Where are the orders for dismantling? Where are the records of the amount of metal collected? The complete absence of a paper trail looks extremely suspicious for such a large-scale undertaking. Even more absurd seems the fate of those roads that weren't melted down, but simply covered with asphalt. Think about this situation. There's a perfectly functioning, solid metal surface. It doesn't sag, doesn't break under load, it's convenient to move on. Road workers arrive and pour asphalt over all of this. Why? What's the point? If the metal coating had become unusable, destroyed, dangerous, then it's understandable. Something needs to be done. But pavements are found in excellent condition, capable of serving for many more years. It turns out that a perfectly working technology was simply taken and buried under a new layer. It's like building a modern highway and then covering it with gravel and laying a dirt road on top. Moreover, laying asphalt over metal creates additional problems. Metal and asphalt have different coefficients of thermal expansion. When temperature changes, they behave differently, which leads to stresses and cracks. Any modern engineer will say this is technologically wrong. But for some reason, that's exactly what they did. The main question in this story sounds simple, but there's no answer to it. Why are there no historical records about these roads? We're talking about mass construction, about the use of huge volumes of metal, about technology that was applied everywhere. How can you build thousands of kilometers of metal roads and not leave a single mention in the archives? No blueprints, no descriptions of the technology, no cost estimates, no construction reports, no mentions in newspapers of that era, no memoirs of engineers or workers. Complete informational silence around a grandiose engineering project. This looks not like loss of documents, but like deliberate destruction of all mentions. People walked on these roads, rode on them in carts and carriages, saw them every day. But no one considered it necessary to write down where they came from, or were the records destroyed later? Or is there some other explanation that's so incredible it was preferred to be silenced? To understand the full absurdity of the situation, we need to look at how real roads were created in the past, what technologies were used, and how much they differ from modern methods. There's a curious comparison that turns the idea of progress upside down. On one hand, the so-called illiterate society of the past, attributed with backwardness and primitive methods. On the other hand, the developed modern civilization with its advanced technologies and scientific achievements. But just look at road construction methods to doubt the correctness of these labels. How did these supposedly illiterate ancestors build roads? The process looked as follows. First, they dug a deep channel, creating a solid foundation for the future road. Then they poured a layer of large gravel, which formed the load-bearing structure and provided drainage. On top, they laid medium-sized gravel, which filled the voids and created a more even surface. The next layer was fine gravel, which leveled all irregularities to an ideal state. After that, the entire structure was carefully compacted and laid with a final coating of carefully processed stone blocks. These stones were fitted to each other so tightly that a knife blade could barely pass between them. The laying was done on a special mortar that bonded the entire structure into a single whole. The result was monolithic, durable, and virtually indestructible. And what does the developed civilization do? When a hole forms in the asphalt, it's simply patched with new asphalt, often so carelessly that the patch stands out in color and texture. If the hole is large, bricks come into play, which are simply thrown into the hole and lightly covered. This is called makeshift work, and this is the approach demonstrated by so-called advanced engineering thought. The irony of the situation is obvious. The technology used by illiterate society is orders of magnitude more complex, thoughtful, and effective than modern methods. Multi-layered structure taking into account loads, drainage, thermal expansion versus simple pouring of hot asphalt on a prepared surface. Even without special education, it's clear which method is more perfect. Moreover, we see something very similar in the famous Roman roads. The same multi-layered structure, the same principle from large fractions to small, the same stone laying on top. And these roads serve for millennia. Literally 2,000 years later, you can still walk and drive on them. Modern asphalt begins to crack and sag after just a few years of operation. A logical question arises. Who was actually more technologically advanced? Those who created roads for centuries, calculating each layer and each element of the structure? Or those who patch holes with bricks and hope it lasts until next season? Official history claims one thing, but facts speak completely differently. If you look more broadly, metal roads fit perfectly into this picture. They represent another level of technological perfection that modern civilization not only cannot reproduce, but cannot even explain. Why use metal for road surfacing? What advantages did this provide? What technology allowed producing such volumes of forged iron? But metal roads turned out not to be the only mystery associated with the use of metal in the past. There are other examples that raise even more questions and destroy familiar notions about the development of technology. Searching for information about metal roads leads to even stranger finds. It turns out metal was used not only for pavements. In old churches and temples, floors are discovered that are completely made of metal. Not separate decorative inserts, not small sections to strengthen the structure, but entire floors covering the entire area of the room. This discovery generates a whole cascade of questions to which there are no intelligible answers. Let's start with the most obvious. Why make metal floors in a temple at all? From a practical point of view, this looks extremely irrational. Metal is cold, especially in winter. Walking on such a floor is uncomfortable. A room with a metal floor will be significantly colder than one with stone or wood. Why not use stone? Stone floors look great in temples. They're durable, they can be decorated with carvings or mosaics. Stone is available. The technology for its processing and laying is well known. Wooden floors would also be a logical choice. They're warm, pleasant to walk on, wood creates a special atmosphere in the room. But instead, they chose metal. The thought arises that metal floors performed some specific function not related to the comfort of parishioners. Could temples have been something more than just places for prayer? There's a version that some old buildings we consider churches were originally power plants or contained powerful electrical installations. A metal floor in such a context makes sense. It could serve as a conductor, grounding, or part of a more complex electrical system. This version seems fantastic, but it at least gives some rational explanation for the strange choice of material. Because, as ordinary flooring, metal simply makes no sense. It's more expensive than stone, colder than wood, more difficult to process and lay. No advantages, only disadvantages, if you don't consider possible electrical properties. But metal wasn't limited to just floors. In the same temples, they find stairs completely made of metal, doors and door structures made of metal, railings, fences, interior elements, all made of metal. The impression is created that the builders intentionally maximize the saturation of the building with metal elements, as if following some important technical requirement. The quality of work is amazing. This isn't rough forging, not primitive processing. Artistic forging of the highest level, with delicate patterns, with complex interweaving of elements, with perfect symmetry. Every detail is worked out to the smallest detail. The craftsmen who created these structures possessed an incredible level of skill and, importantly, had access to large volumes of quality metal. Imagine the volume of work. Forge a metal floor for a medium-sized temple. That's thousands of individual elements, each of which needs to be made, fitted, connected with the others. That's months, possibly years of work by experienced blacksmiths. That's huge expenditures of metal, coal for forges, labor. And all this for a floor? For stairs? Logic suggests that such costs must have had a good justification. Metal elements in temples couldn't be just a decorative whim or tribute to fashion. They performed some important function. So important that they went to colossal expenses and technological difficulties for it. But the most amazing thing about these metal structures isn't even their purpose or scale of application. The most striking thing is their condition in which they've survived to our days. Metal floors and structures dating from 1899 look as if they were installed quite recently. No traces of serious corrosion, no deep rust spots, no destruction of metal structure. They've retained their integrity and functionality after more than a century of operation. This isn't just amazing, it's practically impossible from the point of view of modern metallurgy. Operating conditions were far from ideal. People constantly walked on metal floors, bringing water, dirt, snow in winter. Moisture accumulated on the surface, penetrated into joints between elements. Patterns on forged structures created many depressions where water and dirt lingered. It's precisely in such places that corrosion usually develops fastest. But this doesn't happen. The metal remains stable, patterns retain their clarity, connections don't break down from rust. Even in places of constant contact with water and dirt, where modern metal would be covered with a thick layer of rust in a few years, old structures demonstrate amazing resistance. Cast iron floors deserve special attention. Cast iron is an alloy of iron with carbon. It really is more resistant to corrosion than ordinary iron, but not enough to withstand it for more than a century without any protection. Moreover, creating cast iron floors was more expensive than making stone ones. Casting cast iron requires high temperatures, special molds, complex technology. Processing and laying finished elements also presents considerable difficulty. Why spend more money and effort on a material that theoretically should have been inferior to stone in durability? After all, stone floors in temples serve for centuries and don't require any maintenance. Cast iron floors should have rusted, required painting, repairs, replacement of damaged sections. But this didn't happen. They served without problems and continue to serve to this day. Comparison with modern technologies makes the situation even more absurd. Modern metal rusts constantly and everywhere. Metal structures require regular protection from corrosion, painting, anti-corrosion coatings, cathodic protection. Sea vessels are a separate story altogether. Ship hulls are constantly exposed to salt water, which destroys metal at incredible speed. Shipbuilding companies spend huge amounts on fighting corrosion. Sandblasting is regularly carried out, which removes layers of rust and remnants of old paint. Then new protective coatings are applied, special anti-corrosion compounds, paint. This cycle repeats again and again, because modern metal cannot resist corrosion without constant protection. And this happens in the era of the so-called highly developed civilization that prides itself on its technological achievements. Metallurgy has reached unprecedented heights. Dozens of different alloys have been developed for different purposes. The most complex metal processing technologies exist. But creating metal that doesn't rust without protection for more than 100 years, modern science cannot do. A paradoxical situation emerges. Blacksmiths of the past, working in primitive forges, not having modern equipment and knowledge about the chemical composition of alloys, created metal with characteristics unattainable for modern industry. They produced it in such quantities that it was enough for pavements of entire streets and floors of huge temples. And nowhere did descriptions of their methods and technologies remain. Metal floors and roads aren't the only example of amazing metal from the past. There are artifacts that raise even more questions about the real level of technological development of previous civilizations. Among all the mysterious metal objects of the past, a special place is occupied by the famous iron pillar located in India. This artifact has been standing for several millennia if we believe official dating, and during all this time not a single spot of rust has appeared on it. The pillar is in the open air, exposed to rain, humidity, temperature changes, but remains in perfect condition. What's especially striking is that the pillar was never painted or treated with any protective compounds. It's just iron, standing in the air for thousands of years and not rusting. Any modern metal pillar in such conditions would be covered with a thick layer of rust in a matter of years, and after a few decades would begin to break down. But the ancient pillar stands and doesn't think about corroding. Official science offers an explanation. The pillar is made of meteorite iron, which has special properties. Meteorite iron really does contain other impurities and has a different structure than terrestrial. However, this version raises new questions. Where did they find such a huge meteorite? How was it processed with the technologies of that time? Why use such a rare material for an ordinary pillar, even if in a religious structure? Besides, meteorite iron is also subject to corrosion, just slower than ordinary. But over thousands of years, at least some traces of oxidation should have appeared. There are none. The pillar looks as if it was cast several decades ago, not millennia. This makes you doubt either the dating or the explanation of the nature of the metal, or both statements at once. The iron pillar isn't alone. There are various ancient finds that demonstrate the same resistance to corrosion. Archaeologists find hammers, tools, fragments of iron structures to which they attribute a considerable age. And these objects don't rust. They may be covered with a layer of earth, be in a humid environment, but the metal retains its structure. The contrast with modernity is so sharp that it's impossible to explain it by chance or special storage conditions. Ancient metal objects are found in the most diverse climatic zones, in different types of soil, in conditions of high and low humidity, and everywhere they demonstrate amazing resistance. And modern metal rots and breaks down even with protective coatings and special care. Modern cars begin to rust after a few years of operation, especially in regions where roads are treated with salt in winter. Metal fences, poles, structures require regular painting. Any metal object left outside without protection will be covered with rust in one season. This is a fact that everyone faces. But why does ancient metal behave completely differently? Have metallurgy technologies degraded so much that we've lost the ability to produce corrosion-resistant metal? Or did knowledge and methods exist in the past that were deliberately destroyed or forgotten? Maybe this metal wasn't produced by ordinary metallurgical methods at all? All these facts form a strange picture. Metal roads hidden under asphalt, metal floors in temples that could have been part of some installations, metal that doesn't rust for centuries and millennia without any protection. Absence of historical records about all this, impossibility of reproducing these technologies by modern methods. All this points to one incredible theory that explains many oddities at once and connects disparate facts together. There's a hypothesis that at first glance seems fantastic, but explains many oddities associated with metal structures of the past. According to this theory, in the recent past, electricity was free and distributed everywhere, using technologies different from modern wired systems. And all these metal elements in buildings and on streets were part of this global energy network. Metal roads in this context acquire a completely different meaning. They could serve as conductors, elements of a system for transmitting or distributing energy. Perhaps the transport of that time used this energy directly, moving on metal pavements. This would explain the mass use of expensive material and complex laying technology. Roads weren't just routes of communication, but part of the energy infrastructure. Metal floors in temples also fit into this picture. If the buildings we call churches were originally power plants or energy distribution nodes, then metal floors performed the function of grounding, wiring, or part of more complex electrical circuits. The extensive use of metal in the structures of these buildings, stairs, doors, interior elements, all this could have been necessary for the system to function. Iron structures with special properties, resistant to corrosion, could have been specially created to work in this system. Perhaps the very process of their use in the electrical network somehow protected the metal from oxidation. Or the technology for producing these elements included processing that gave the metal special characteristics necessary for electrical applications and simultaneously protected against rust. This theory also explains the complete absence of historical records. If there was a developed technological civilization with free energy available to everyone, this posed a threat to those who wanted to control resources and the population. Destroying this system and all mentions of it would be a logical step to establish control over energy resources and create people's dependence on centralized energy supply. But this theory raises new questions related to the scale of production of all these metal structures. How much labor was required to create kilometers of metal roads, huge metal floors in dozens and hundreds of buildings, thousands of various elements and details? If all this was produced manually, by blacksmiths in ordinary forges, then we're talking about fantastic volumes of work. Imagine, each element of the metal pavement needs to be forged separately. Heat the metal in the hearth to the required temperature, process with a hammer, give shape, cool. Then, assemble thousands of such elements into a single structure. This is the work of many years for large teams of blacksmiths. Multiply this by the number of city streets covered with metal, and you get work that would take decades, even with a huge number of craftsmen. This looks absurd. Such labor costs for simple road surfacing make no sense. But if metal roads were a necessary part of technological infrastructure, then the costs are justified. Just as modern civilization spends huge resources on laying electrical networks, because without them, the system doesn't work. On the other hand, if this was machine casting, if technologies for mass production of metal elements existed, then an even more important question arises. Where are these technologies now? Why can't we reproduce them? Modern industry is capable of mass casting, but it cannot create metal with the same properties as antique. Cannot produce structures that don't rust for centuries without protection. It turns out that either there was a highly developed industrial base that completely disappeared without a trace, or production methods were completely different, based on principles that modern science doesn't know or doesn't recognize. In any case, we're dealing with lost knowledge and technologies, the scale of which is difficult to assess. The main mystery of this whole story lies not in the technical details of metal roads or floors, not in the chemical composition of rust-proof metal, and not even in theories about free electricity. The main question sounds simpler and more frightening. Why is this being silenced? Why is information about the mass use of metal structures in the past practically absent from official sources? Open any history textbook. You'll find detailed descriptions of political events, wars, changes of rulers, cultural movements. You'll read about the development of industry, about the construction of factories and plants, about the laying of railways. But nowhere will you encounter mention that city streets were covered with metal pavements. Nowhere will you find a description of the technology for creating these structures, the names of engineers who designed them, companies that produced them. Official historical sources also keep silent. There are no archival documents about orders for metal road surfaces, no estimates, calculations, reports on work done. No newspaper articles of that time admiring new technologies or criticizing them. Complete informational void around a phenomenon that should have been a significant event in the life of cities. This cannot be a simple loss of documents. We're talking about large-scale construction in dozens, possibly hundreds of settlements. It's impossible for all mentions of this to disappear by accident. fires, wars, revolutions can destroy part of the archives, but not all at once, and not so selectively as to erase information about one specific phenomenon, leaving everything else. It remains to assume deliberate silencing. Someone, at some point, made a decision to remove this information from public access, not include it in textbooks, not mention it in official history. This assumption sounds like a conspiracy theory. But how else to explain such a complete absence of data about a phenomenon whose physical evidence is still being found under layers of asphalt? Perhaps the loss of knowledge occurred during some cataclysm, war, or social upheaval, when the old system was destroyed and the new one was built on different principles. People could deliberately distance themselves from the technologies of the past, considering them dangerous or simply incomprehensible. The next generations no longer had access to this knowledge and couldn't restore it. In any case, it's important to understand one thing. The history we're taught may be incomplete. The official version of past events doesn't always coincide with reality. Archaeological finds, accidental discoveries during road repairs, artifacts that don't fit into the accepted chronology, all this indicates the existence of blank spots in our understanding of history. Don't believe anyone at their word. Check everything yourself. This applies not only to information from this video, but to any other sources, including official textbooks and scientific publications. Critical thinking, the ability to ask questions and seek answers independently, is the only way to approach the truth. If this information was interesting and useful to you, share it with friends. The more people learn about oddities in official history, the greater the chances that someone will find additional facts, documents, or explanations. Hit like if you want to see more such investigations, more materials about forgotten technologies and unexplained artifacts of the past. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about mysteries of history. Perhaps the next discovery will shed light on this mystery, or open new questions, even more amazing and inexplicable. What are your versions of what's happening? How do you explain the existence of metal roads and their disappearance from historical records? Maybe you have information about similar finds in your region. Write in the comments. Let's discuss this together. The collective mind is capable of more than individual researchers. Remember, history can hide much more than we think. What we consider long studied and understood may turn out to be just a superficial layer, under which amazing technologies, forgotten knowledge, and incredible events of the past are hidden.